Think about a 10-year-old kid today. Maybe it's your kid, your nephew, or just a kid you saw waiting for the school bus this morning. Their biggest worries are probably homework, video games, or making it to soccer practice on time. We look at that and we think, that's normal. That's what childhood is supposed to be. But here's something that might genuinely disturb you. For the vast majority of American history, that concept of childhood simply did not exist. Imagine that same 10-year-old waking up at 4 a.m., not to get ready for school, but to walk into a freezing, pitch-black coal mine. Imagine them standing barefoot on the floor of a deafening textile mill, risking their fingers in massive, unshielded machinery for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And the most terrifying part? It was all completely legal. No government agency was coming to save them. No laws were being broken. In fact, the system didn't just allow this to happen, it practically demanded it. For over a century, the United States built its booming industrial empire, the very foundation of its modern wealth, on the backs of an invisible army of children. So, the question isn't just how a civilized society let this happen. The real question is, why did the most powerful corporations on Earth fight so ruthlessly to keep 8-year-olds on the assembly line? And what finally forced the entire system to change in 1938? The answer takes us into one of the darkest, most carefully buried chapters of American capitalism. To understand how child labor became the dark engine of the American economy, you have to understand the lie that society told itself to make it okay. For generations before the Industrial Revolution, children had always worked, but they worked on family farms. A boy helping his father plow a field, or a girl helping harvest crops. That was considered a natural, healthy part of growing up. It was tied to the rhythm of the seasons, the sun, and the family unit. So, when the late 1800s arrived, bringing massive, dirty factories, towering smokestacks, and deafening machines, the men in power simply carried that old farm logic into the new industrial world. They told the public that factory work was good for kids. It kept them out of trouble. It built character. It prevented idleness. But a factory is not a farm. The farm had winter breaks and rainy days. The factory never stopped. Machines don't care if the sun goes down, and they certainly don't care if an 8-year-old is exhausted. Suddenly, kids weren't working alongside their parents in the fresh air. They were locked inside sweltering sweatshops, packing plants, and steel mills. The gentle rhythm of nature was completely erased, replaced by the brutal, relentless speed of the assembly line. And unlike a father teaching his son a trade, the factory foreman had only one goal: maximum output, no matter the human cost. The public was sold a romanticized illusion of hard-working American youth, but the reality was a nightmare of absolute exploitation. The titans of industry knew exactly what they were doing. Behind closed doors, they weren't hiring children to build their character. They were hiring them because of a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly ruthless mathematical equation that would define American capitalism for the next 50 years. Let's look at the actual numbers. Why did the booming corporations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries actively prefer to hire a 9-year-old over a fully grown, capable adult man? It came down to a deeply cynical, incredibly profitable corporate logic. First, there was the price tag. Children were dirt cheap. A factory owner could hire a kid to work the exact same brutal 12-hour shift as an adult, but pay them a fraction of the wage. Sometimes as little as 40 cents a day. For a textile mill or a coal company employing hundreds of workers, swapping men for kids meant profit margins skyrocketed overnight. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about control. In the late 1800s, adult workers were starting to wake up. They were forming labor unions. They were organizing strikes, demanding safer working conditions, and violently pushing back against abusive bosses. You know who doesn't form a labor union? An 8-year-old. You know who doesn't go on strike when the ventilation fails or the hours get extended? A terrified kid. If a foreman yelled at a child, or even hit them, which happened constantly, the child didn't fight back. They didn't demand rights. They just cried, and then they kept working. They were the ultimate compliant workforce. And then there was the darkest reason of all. their anatomy. The massive, steam-powered machines driving this new economy were constantly jamming. When a spinning loom tangled, you couldn't just shut down the factory. Time was money. You needed someone small enough to crawl under the heavy, moving gears. You needed tiny, nimble fingers to reach into the crushing mechanical jaws and pull out the snagged cotton. Kids weren't just cheap labor. They were living, breathing replacement parts for the machines. And when those machines inevitably caught a tiny hand or arm, the child was simply fired and replaced by the next day. But nowhere was this horror more obvious or more deadly than deep underground. Let's travel to the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania in the early 1900s. If you were a boy born in these mining towns, your childhood ended the moment you turned 8 or 9. You didn't go to school, you went to the breaker. You became a breaker boy. Imagine a massive, towering wooden structure shaking violently from the roar of grinding machinery. Inside, it is so thick with black coal dust that you can barely see the kid sitting 2 feet next to you. You can't breathe without coughing up dark soot. The job was brutal, but simple. These little boys sat on wooden planks suspended directly over rushing chutes of jagged, unprocessed coal. For 10 hours a day, their job was to reach into that fast-moving river of rock with their bare hands and pick out the pieces of useless slate. They weren't allowed to wear gloves because gloves slowed them down. Within weeks, the sharp coal would tear the skin right off their fingers. The boys called it red top when their fingers bled so much the tips were stained permanently red. If a boy stopped to nurse a bleeding hand, the breaker boss was standing right behind him with a wooden stick, ready to strike him across the back. But bleeding fingers were the lucky outcome. The noise of the coal was so deafening that you couldn't even hear a scream. Sometimes, an exhausted boy would slip. He would fall into the rushing chute and be pulled down into the massive, crushing gears below. And the truly terrifying part, the factory didn't stop. The gears kept grinding. They simply pulled the broken body out, told the next 9-year-old to slide down and take his spot, and the coal kept flowing. Child death wasn't a tragedy. To the coal companies, it was just a minor operational delay. But if you think the boys in the mines had it bad, wait until you see what the corporate machine was doing to the little girls above ground. While the boys were vanishing into the dark of the coal mines, the little girls were being fed into an entirely different kind of monster, the American textile mill. Step inside a cotton mill in the early 1900s, and the first thing that hits you is the noise. Massive, room-sized mechanical looms violently smashing back and forth. The sound was so physically deafening that adults went permanently deaf, forcing workers to invent their own sign language just to communicate. In the middle of this chaos were the bobbin girls. These were girls as young as 7 or 8 years old. Their job was to stand barefoot on the slippery, lint-covered wooden floors and replace the heavy bobbins of thread as they ran out. But remember the golden rule of the factory: the machines never stop. These little girls had to reach their tiny hands into the rapidly spinning, unguarded gears to swap out the thread. A fraction of a second of hesitation meant a crushed hand or severed fingers. Even worse, if a girl leaned in too far and her hair got caught in the high-speed belts, it could literally rip her scalp off. And they couldn't just walk away or take a break when they were tired. To ensure maximum productivity and prevent anyone from stepping outside for fresh air, factory bosses routinely locked the heavy wooden doors from the outside. These children were literally trapped inside. Which leads to the most obvious, burning question. When you hear about a 9-year-old boy bleeding in a coal mine, or a 7-year-old girl locked inside a deafening factory, your brain immediately asks, what kind of evil parent would ever allow this? Were these parents just monsters? The truth is actually much darker. It is easy to judge the parents of the past. To look at an old, grainy photograph of a dirty, exhausted kid in a factory and think, I would never let my child do that. But these parents weren't monsters. They were hostages. The corporations of the late 19th century had engineered a flawless, deeply cynical system designed to force every single member of a family into the factory doors. And the ultimate weapon they used was the father's paycheck. If a man worked 60 hours a week in a steel mill or a coal mine, you would assume he made enough to feed his family. But he didn't. Industry titans deliberately kept adult wages at literal starvation levels. They ran the cold math and realized that if they paid a man just enough to barely survive, he would be desperate. And a desperate man will do anything to keep his kids from going hungry. When the father's meager wages couldn't cover the rent, the mother had to go to work. When both of their paychecks combined still couldn't buy enough food or coal to survive the brutal winter, the family faced a horrifying choice: watch their children starve or send them to the factory. The parents didn't want their 8-year-olds dodging spinning saw blades or coughing up black lung. They sent them because the alternative was death. The system was rigged so perfectly that child labor wasn't a choice. It was a basic survival requirement. But keeping wages low was just step one of the corporate playbook. Because if you really wanted to trap a working-class family, you didn't just control their paycheck, you controlled the very ground they walked on. Welcome to the terrifying reality of the company town. Imagine your boss is not just your boss. Imagine he is also your landlord. He owns the grocery store where you buy your food, the doctor you see when you are sick, and the school your kids are supposed to attend. Welcome to the company town. In the early 1900s, massive corporations, especially in coal, steel, and textiles, didn't just build factories. They built entire, isolated towns around them. And this gave them a level of control over human beings that is hard to comprehend today. Here is how the extortion worked. Many of these companies stopped paying their workers in actual United States dollars. Instead, they paid them in scrip, fake corporate currency that was completely worthless everywhere else. You could only spend this scrip at the official company store. And surprise, the company store charged double or triple the price for basic necessities like flour, milk, and winter coats. Before a worker even finished his first month on the job, he was mathematically trapped in massive debt to his own employer. And this is exactly where the children come in. When the father inevitably couldn't pay his debt to the company store, the foreman would knock on his door with a simple, terrifying proposition. Put your boys in the mine, put your girls in the mill, and we will clear your debt. What could the father say? If he refused, he was fired. But because his boss was also his landlord, being fired meant his family was instantly evicted, thrown onto the freezing street with absolutely nothing, holding only worthless corporate scrip. It was a flawless system of modern-day feudalism. The corporations had locked the doors, and nobody was coming to help, until one man decided to break the rules and show the world exactly what was hiding in the dark. The corporations had absolute control. They owned the politicians, they owned the towns, and they owned the narrative. The public was completely blind to the true horrors of the factory floor because no outsider was ever allowed inside. But they couldn't stop a man named Hine. Hine wasn't a politician, a wealthy lawyer, or a labor union boss. He was a school teacher and a sociologist from New York, armed with a bulky, heavy camera. And in 1908, he decided to do something incredibly dangerous. He decided to break into the matrix and show the world the truth. Hine knew that statistics and boring government reports wouldn't change anything. People needed to see the blood, the dirt, and the exhausted faces of these children with their own eyes. So, he went undercover. He traveled across the country, sneaking into highly guarded textile mills, coal mines, and glass factories. He disguised himself as a fire inspector, a Bible salesman, or an industrial machinery photographer. He would quickly set up his heavy camera equipment, pull a terrified child aside, and snap a picture before the factory foreman realized what was happening. If Hine had been caught by the company thugs, he would have been severely beaten or even killed. The factory owners fiercely protected their dark secrets. But Hine was absolutely fearless. The photographs he took are some of the most haunting, iconic images in American history. You have probably seen them without even knowing it. Little girls covered in cotton lint standing next to massive looms. Kids missing fingers, staring dead-eyed straight into the camera lens. Hine didn't just take pictures, he aggressively documented the truth. He wrote down their names, their exact ages, and their severe injuries. He made the invisible army completely visible to the American public. He permanently shattered that romantic illusion of the character-building factory. When these photos finally hit newspapers and magazines, the public was horrified. The secret was out. You would assume that seeing these heartbreaking images would immediately force the government to shut child labor down overnight. But you would be wrong, because the titans of industry were not going to give up their cheapest workers without a brutal, vicious fight. When Louis Hine's heartbreaking photographs hit the front pages, you'd think the politicians would have instantly shut the whole system down. But that's not how power works in America. The titans of industry, the mill owners, the coal barons, the steel tycoons, didn't apologize. They didn't feel shame. Instead, they launched one of the most aggressive, well-funded propaganda campaigns in American history. They poured massive amounts of money into lobbying. They bought off senators and judges. And they spun a narrative that sounds terrifyingly familiar today. They told the public that banning child labor would absolutely destroy American capitalism. They argued that if factories couldn't employ 10-year-olds, businesses would go bankrupt, prices would skyrocket, and the entire economy would collapse. But they didn't stop at economic fear. They made it deeply political. Corporate lobbyists argued that child labor laws were a dangerous socialist plot. They claimed that the government stepping in to save kids from coal mines was a direct attack on a parent's personal freedom. They actually convinced people that it was a father's God-given right to send his 8-year-old daughter into a spinning textile loom, and the federal government had no business interfering. And for a long time, it worked. The corporate elite even had the United States Supreme Court on their side. In 1918, the Supreme Court literally struck down a federal law banning child labor, ruling it unconstitutional. The system protected itself perfectly. The harsh truth is, morality, photographs, and public outrage were never going to be enough to beat the raw power of corporate money. So, what finally broke the machine? What actually got the kids out of the factories? It wasn't a sudden awakening of the American conscience. It was a brutal mathematical crisis that brought the entire country to its knees. Think about the greatest irony in American history. All the protests, all of Louis Hine's heartbreaking photographs, all the moral outrage of the early 1900s, none of it actually stopped child labor. The corporate machine was simply too powerful, and the politicians were too easily bought. What finally saved the children wasn't a sudden burst of human morality. It was the total collapse of the American economy. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the United States into the Great Depression. Suddenly, the rules of the game completely changed. By the early 1930s, roughly 25% of the American workforce was completely unemployed. Millions of fully grown, capable adult men were standing in breadlines, starving, and becoming increasingly desperate. But as these men rioted in the streets begging for any kind of work, a dark reality remained. Many factories were still employing 10-year-olds. Why? Because the kids were still cheaper. This created an impossible, highly explosive situation for the government. You cannot have millions of angry, voting-age men starving in the streets while an army of children does their jobs for 40 cents a day. The math was no longer just cruel, it was politically suicidal. And right there, the entire narrative shifted. The politicians didn't suddenly grow a conscience about bleeding fingers in the coal mines. They just realized that if they legally banned child labor, they could instantly open up millions of paying jobs for unemployed adult men. Banning child labor was no longer just a humanitarian rescue mission. It was a cold, calculated economic strategy to lower the adult unemployment rate and prevent a full-scale revolution. For the first time in history, getting the kids out of the factories became politically profitable. And that cynical mathematical reality is what finally paved the way for the law that changed everything. In 1938, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law. This was the final, devastating blow to the industrial child labor machine. It established minimum wages, set maximum working hours, and officially banned oppressive child labor across the United States. The massive factories were finally forced to let the children go. The breaker boys and the bobbin girls faded into the history books. But remember how this system operates. True power never simply surrenders. It negotiates. The corporate lobbyists made absolutely sure that a massive, deliberate loophole was written right into the very fabric of the law. The 1938 Act completely exempted agriculture, and that loophole still exists today. Right now, in modern America, children as young as 12 can legally work grueling, back-breaking hours on massive commercial farms, as long as it doesn't conflict with their school hours. The old romantic farm illusion was used to protect corporate profits one last time. And if we take a step back and look at the global picture, we have to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Did massive multinational corporations really stop using child labor? Or did they just move it to places where you can't see it? Think about the cheap, fast fashion clothes you might be wearing right now. Think about the cobalt and lithium battery powering the very smartphone you are holding in your hand. There is a terrifyingly high probability that somewhere deep in that global supply chain, an 8-year-old child halfway across the world pulled that raw metal out of the dirt for pennies a day. We didn't end the system. We just outsourced it. We made the invisible army invisible all over again. The protected childhood we consider totally normal today wasn't a natural human right given freely by society. It was the result of a brutal, bloody war fought against the most powerful people on Earth. If this story changed the way you think about the world, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. We go deep on the hidden systems of money and power that shape your life without your permission. See you in the next one.